I feel like back when I started this channel, I talked about historical fiction all of the time, and I barely talk about historical fiction anymore, and I've not read as much historical fiction as I used to either. I think that reading the Goodreads Choice Award historical fiction 2 years in a row has kind of put me off, because there's a lot of historical fiction that I don't like. It's so broad. There's a lot of those a woman in period dress and airplanes in the background for World War II. That's not what I'm here for. A lot of the big ones like Philippa Gregory or whatever, also not for me. But I'm going to try and reignite my love for historical fiction, and I hope you will enjoy coming along with me. Hello, my name's Roisin, so if you ever meet someone with that name, you will know how to pronounce it. So I thought this week, in the reading vlog, I would try and read some historical fiction with you. I don't know how much I'm going to get to read, because I'm still in the middle of A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo, my real life book club. That's what we're reading this month, so I need to get that finished. And I'm also reading Possession, which again is not historical fiction, for my book club on this channel, the Big Book Club. Information in the cards above. So I've got some stuff that I'm reading that I'm not going to talk about. So we'll see how much I can actually get to, because I've got quite a lot, and also historical fiction is often quite large. I'll show you some of the options that we have. The physical books that I have copies of, we have Little Sons by Zakasunda, which is set in the turn of the 20th century in South Africa and Lesotho. We have The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton, a very popular, famous one, which is set in Amsterdam in the 17th century. We have The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver, a giant book. Maybe I should save this for a big book club read. America is Not the Heart by Elaine Castillo. This is maybe 80s or 90s, set about Filipino people coming to America. The Burning Chamber by Kate Moss, another chunky, popular book. And Perfume, the Story of a Murderer by Patrick Suskind, also set in France but in the 18th century. I also have some audiobooks and some ebooks, so I'm going to see where things take me. Tonight I am going to see The Crucible at the Gielgud Theatre in the West End, and that is historical fiction, isn't it? Because Arthur Miller wrote it in the 50s, but it is set during the witch trials in Salem. I studied The Crucible at school, so I know the play pretty well, and I'm excited to see this adaptation. Let's go to the theatre. I'm going to get changed though. I don't think dungarees are theatre wear. I last spoke to you on Monday, and it is now Friday, and I haven't spoken to you at all this week. I've not been particularly well. I've been working all week as well, so that takes up a lot of my time, but my fatigue has been fatiguing this week, and I have just been absolutely exhausted, which has made coming on camera a bit daunting. It's also so hot, and I feel like when it's hot my fatigue gets so much worse. I've also not read much. I have read a lot of Possession by A.S. Byatt. I'm over halfway now, so that's good, but I'm not talking to you about this in this, because that will be the Big Book Club live show. And then I also started listening to the audiobook of 5 Little Indians by Michelle Good, which was a story of 5 Indigenous people in Canada's residential school system, and I DNF'd it. I am trying to DNF more this year, trying to not push through a book that I know isn't going to work for me, just because, particularly books like 5 Little Indians, where I know that the story, the plot might be interesting. It seems like it's a very plotty book, and the sort of part of history and culture that it's telling, like residential school systems in Canada in the 20th century, is something that I'm interested in, and so I push through because I have that interest in it, despite the fact that I don't like the writing, and I cannot get on with the book if I don't like the writing. It just doesn't work for me. I need a book to be written in a style that I enjoy. It's always something where the actual writing is clearly part of what the author is doing, rather than the writing being only there to facilitate plot or characters. It not being a part of the experience of reading the book is something that I don't really like. And also, I don't really like super plotty books most of the time, because I feel like they neglect the writing in order to fulfill the plot. The writing is purely in service of the plot, and I just can't get on with that. And I'm sure there are a lot of books by Indigenous Canadians that do fit my preferred style, and so I think I probably should try and find one of them, rather than persevere with a book that I'm going to end up giving a mediocre review, because it just isn't for me in terms of the style of writing. I've also started America Is Not the Heart by Elaine Castillo. I'm only 30 pages in and I really like it so far. The prologue is written in second person, and having had a brief like flick to the other pages, I think the rest of it is in third, so it's not like that continues throughout the book, but I have enjoyed the way that it's being used. The first part is about a woman in the Philippines in the 70s and 80s, becomes a nurse, and she goes to the States, and it's about her childhood and her like growing up and her life and her relationships and things in a very short period of time. It's like a condensed biography of her in the second person, but I'm loving the writing so far. And last year I read The Betrayed by Riene Akake Melvin, which is set at a similar time period, and it's interesting because in this book it says something about the two union leaders were shot in San Francisco, and The Betrayed is about the two daughters of one of those union leaders who were shot in San Francisco. So clearly there is an overlap there, because this is going to be about Filipino late second half of the 20th century history and politics and the relationship of that, the martial law that was imposed, the Marcos regime, and I guess what's happened afterwards, and the relationship between Filipinos in America and Filipinos in the Philippines. So yes, I'm loving the writing so far, and I'm glad, because this was one that, like in 2020, all the booktube litfic girls were reading and raving. So I finally got here, but yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. This weekend, because it is now Friday afternoon, I have finished work for the weekend. The only thing, I want to try and do some DIY in the house. We also have a moth problem at the moment. We have wool carpets upstairs and there are moths in them, and so I think we may be this weekend taking out the carpets. So you may see some footage of me with a Stanley knife and a crowbar. So if I've got the energy, that might be fun.
One of the other were dead, this entire second go without it, I'm still living. So I feel as though, perhaps, it's some good cheers.
I appreciate the bok choy thing, but I don't look in the recipe. I've got to say, having a fringe and riding a bike are not compatible things. Anyway, so I am nearly through Possession, which is good because the live show is in 4 days, and I am halfway through America Is Not the Heart by Elaine Castillo, and I have to say this one definitely lives up to the hype, which I'm glad about, because well, I guess it was hyped very much by Hannah May, but I don't think it's an overhyped book. It's sometimes one person really hypes up a book and then you read it and you're like, oh, it's a shame that I don't like it because it's such a specific person who's recommended it. But I really am so far enjoying this book. It started off being about one person and told in the second person, like I said, and then the rest of it so far has been about Hero, or Hieronyma. It is set in the States in the 90s, but it does also flash back to Hieronyma's past. We're learning about what she experienced in the Philippines, being part of the New People's Army, I think, maybe, fighting against the dictatorship of Marcos. And so we have some flashbacks to her experience living there, and then also of being an undocumented Filipino immigrant in California in the 1990s, looking after her niece, and her niece has extreme eczema all over her body, which, as someone who used to have extreme psoriasis all over my body, is a very relatable experience. But yeah, I'm enjoying it. I think it is, the writing's really good. I would say it's good plot, good writing, but I can see how someone might say nothing happens. Like, it definitely has stuff happening more than what I normally read, but it's not a huge amount of plot. It's more like a slice of life we are experiencing as she goes through life. She meets people, and she's also a queer woman, so I guess I've read something queer in Pride Month. Yeah, I'm enjoying it. I think that it's really nicely written. There is some really lyrical, beautiful parts, but also like the dialogue feels very real, and I'm enjoying that. There's no speech marks if that's something you don't like. So yeah, we'll continue to see how it goes, see the themes that is exploring, and I'll get back to you at the end. I'm also halfway through Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, and I'm enjoying that too. I think it's really nicely written. It's written in such a way that it feels like an autobiography. It is about a young boy in Canada, I think in the 1950s, I think. Him and his brother and sister are like under threat to be taken as well, so they go and hide in the bush, as he calls it. And it starts off with his growing up in a like rural, traditional, indigenous upbringing, First Nations upbringing, traditional Ojibwe upbringing, but then eventually he does end up in one of the residential schools and playing hockey. And the way that it talks about the residential schools is very matter of fact, all of the abuse that went on there, but I think it feels very real. That's what obviously it is based on real events, but it feels like our main character feels so properly real and living that I really thought maybe it was like auto-fiction or semi-autobiographical. It seems no, but it is experience of a lot of his family. I think at the beginning there is a note to say that it is what he experienced different forms of abuse. Five Little Indians, which I gave up on, was also dealing with the residential schools, but the writing of that one really didn't work for me, whereas the writing of this one does. I'm listening to the audiobook. I think the audiobook is well narrated as well, which makes a difference. So I am enjoying it. It's very matter of fact. It's very straightforward, but I think that it works very well for the subject matter that it is dealing with. I've also started The Miniaturist, but I'm only a short way in. I'm not yet sure about the writing, whether it's going to gel with me or whether I'm going to give up on it, but yeah, I'm going to give that a go as well the next few days, and I will get back to you. I am so tired. I'm so tired, and I'm supposed to be cycling to work. It's also raining quite a lot.
Sliding since I don't remember when, in and out of consciousness, while others might be stressing now, we rely on our facade to help us out.
Today I'm going to my friend's 30th birthday party, hence I'm a little more dressed up in this clip. I'm going to talk to you about books. So I have finished Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, and I did enjoy the story. Well, enjoy is probably the wrong word. Like I said, it is about residential schools, the residential schools system for First Nations children in Canada, and the abuse that happened there, and then also his experience being like a hockey star. He was very good at hockey, and so he gets scouted, and his experience playing with white teams and playing with Indigenous teams, and their experience playing against white people, and being kind of famous for hockey in the 1960s, and the way that the white people did not take kindly to his presence there, and the abuse that he experienced at the hands of the crowds, and his losing his love in the game, and his losing his he never wanted to fight, he didn't want to react, he didn't want to like let them get into his head, but everybody was like, why aren't you fighting this? And then when he did, he kind of lost his love of the game. And so it's really a story about survival and the ways that people find to survive, people's coping mechanisms, as well as delving back into the history of Canada and the treatment of First Nations people, the kidnappings of children, and the abuse that went on at the hands of priests and nuns. It reads like a biography. It's nicely written in terms of the way that it hangs together, and the voice is very strong, but it's not too poetic. It's fairly straightforward in terms of being a chronological story of his life and his experience, and his like mental health, and the way that the systemic can affect the individual. And it was hard to read and really emotional, but also I think very powerful and very well done. There are only two things that I will say I thought were a bit off. The first one is that I'm not a hockey person, so I think that that's probably part of the reason for it. I don't even know if I'm a sports in fiction person. I don't know if I would really enjoy that. Like, I'll watch sports, I'll watch football, tennis, rugby, I'll enjoy watching sports, but I don't know if I can really enjoy reading about sports. And also, like I said, I'm not a hockey person. I don't even know how many people there are on a hockey team. So like, I know nothing about hockey. So reading about it, reading about his different plays and the way that he saw the game and the different things he did in order to try and win a game, it got a little repetitive. Like, it was nicely written enough for me to feel engaged and to feel the tension of, for example, his First Nations team playing against a white team and who've asked him to play, and his discomfort from his experience playing with white people before, and the like desire to win, but also the desire not to get drawn into it as a First Nations versus white people narrative. And so I felt the tension then, but there were just so many hockey games. And so that felt a little unnecessary, a little repetitive. And then also, it felt like the pacing was a little off. It is a story about residential schools, but it also begins with our main character, Saul Indian Horse, telling us that he is in an addiction recovery program, and he has to tell his story about addiction and recovery in order to like overcome the things that he has gone through. The beginning of the hiding, and then in the residential schools there was a middle about hockey, but then the end it felt a lot shorter, a lot more condensed. His experience being an adult, being on the road, and being an alcoholic, being an addict, that all felt very compressed and not very fleshed out at all, and I felt like that was missing. I felt like we could have cut some of the hockey scenes for some more of his later in life. Overall, I think it was a good book and a worthwhile read, but yeah, as I said, I had a few quibbles with the structure of the book. I'm also now about halfway through The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton, and it's fine. Like, it's just fine. I think I'm gonna keep reading it. I know I've talked in this video about how I want to DNF more, but I think I'm going to keep reading it because, one, I've got the audiobook now, so I'm listening to it, which she reads herself, and it is like a very easy read. Like, the writing reminds me of like Tessa Dare, or like, it's not a romance. This is not a romance in any stretch of the imagination, but it reads like that, or like C.L. Polk, like something set historically, but not super interested in creating the historical time period, which, when I read historical fiction, I want the setting to feel really real. I want to feel like I am inside that time period, and this, none of the characters feel like they're of that time period. There are lots of descriptions of things that happen in Amsterdam of the time period, but it doesn't feel like our characters are grounded in that time. It just feels like we are being told things, noticing the time, and the language is very modern as well. So for that reason, it doesn't really work for me as the kind of historical fiction I like, but it's fine for like an easy read. There's some historical fiction that is fun, like the Lyman Chronicles is just fun, silly, rumpy, swashbuckling historical fiction, but what it does really well is make you feel like you are in the 16th century. The language and the characters, they feel very much of that time, even though they were written in the 1960s, whereas these characters feel very modern. The writing feels very modern, and they feel kind of divorced from the setting. This is the story of a young girl, Nella Oortman? I'm sorry to Dutch people, but she is married to this older man. He's 39, she's 18, and she moves from her rural town to Amsterdam, and she moves in with her husband's family, but she never sees her husband. He never comes to her at night. Like, she's very confused as to what's going on, and he gives her as a wedding present a doll's house that is a complete replica of the house in which she is living, and she starts to contact this miniaturist to fill out her house, and the miniaturist sends her more than she expected and very specific to the house, like as if the miniaturist knows more than they are letting on. And so there's kind of a mystery around the miniaturist, around the money, around the sale of this sugar, and there is a black man servant who's living in the house as well, and so there is a touch on like slavery and how the sugar came to be in Amsterdam in the first place. I'm kind of sick of feminist historical fiction and feminist, like the Greek myth retellings and stuff like that. I'm kind of sick of them all, and it's because the feminism that is often used in them is very like mainstream pop feminism, choice feminism, very individualist. It is women in that time period being like, this time was difficult for women, but this one spunky heroine is going to rebel against that, and it just It falls a little flat for me. I mean, this is from 2014, so it is written when girl boss feminism was less deconstructed than it has been since in the popular feminist sphere. I mean, obviously girl boss feminism was being deconstructed just as it was, like, the whole time it was rising. But I mean, I think most people now are aware of the foibles of girl boss feminism in a way they potentially weren't when Jessie Burton was writing this in 2013. It just makes me roll my eyes a little bit. It feels like it's lacking in nuance. It's very, this is the right thing and I'm being very right, but very right by the, like, a sort of liberal feminism that I personally don't agree with, and think it's just so individualist. It's just so about these individual women and nothing about systems or about how they are fighting against the system, almost in a not like other girls kind of a way. I don't know, I feel like it's lacking in nuance, it's lacking in subtlety, it's lacking in real depth of character development, it's just not interesting to me. You know, like how the way that Downton Abbey just doesn't deal with class, I feel like this just doesn't deal with class either, and doesn't feel very grounded in the time period that it is. So I'll continue reading it because, as I said at the beginning, it's fine. But I think I'm also maybe going to try and pick up Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, because I feel like maybe that would be more up my street. But I'm going to a party now, so you may see me a bit later at a party, or you may see me tomorrow morning hungover. Who knows? America Is Not the Heart by Elaine Castillo. I really enjoyed it, particularly to begin with. I thought the writing was very good. It's definitely a plotty, good writing book. If that is something you're interested in, there is a lot that happens, a kind of family saga situation where there are lots of sort of secrets, and it definitely has that feeling of families that don't talk to each other and don't express what they're feeling, and so there is a lot to be read in between the lines of the ways people are experiencing. I thought that that was in the kind of layering of different perspectives are brought in, and the only ways we get to know various different characters, we see different sides of them when that is brought in, and I thought that that was well done. However, I did find that it got a little melodramatic towards the end, and I didn't love that as much. Not in so much in terms of the events of the novel, but in terms of the writing, it gets very earnest. It has been so long, this novel of people who can't tell each other things, who keep things hidden and are very repressed, and then all of a sudden it becomes very, like, emotive in a way that feels disconnected with the rest of the book. I did enjoy the relationships in it. As I said, I just found the ending, it got a little cringy for me. It kind of reminded me of Dominicana in that way as well, both quite cringy books.
Noir is very interesting because of the way that it is sort of historical or folklore and it's sciencey one, and the way these together and sort of it's very smart and really extraordinary.
With each film, with each chapter.
I have finished The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton, but I have to say that I finished this ages ago, so my memory of this is not 100%, but I think how I felt in the middle is kind of how I felt throughout. It's a very plotty book where a lot happens, especially in the second half of the book. There are a lot of events and, like, shocking twists. However, I thought all of the twists were really obvious and really well laid out, so nothing surprised me about the book at all. It was very much a twist in as much as Chekhov's gun is now a twist. Like, you know that that's supposed to happen because that's how stories work, and so everything that was laid out in here, like in terms of what happened to people, was very obvious to me from the start, and there was also a lot of convenience, things that meant that in the future you wouldn't have to worry about something because of the way that it had turned out. So you know how much I dislike secret pregnancy, sudden pregnancy in historical fiction. I've talked about it a lot. Usually it's like the first time someone has sex, they instantly get pregnant, and that's going to cause a lot of issues, but usually they have a miscarriage, so it doesn't actually cause any issues. And I hate that, like, convenience, contrivance of the plot, and it wasn't done exactly the same way in here. There was definitely a new way that it was done. Still, there was a lot of convenience in terms of what happened. It just felt like it was so obvious what was going to happen that I couldn't feel the tragedy because it wasn't, like, embedded. The characters didn't feel, they all felt like archetypes rather than people, and it was just it fell flat for me. I can see why it's a best-selling historical fiction, because it has like a lot of plot, a lot of similarities to like more thrillery books in terms of the plottiness and the paciness and the suspense if you didn't predict it, which I think if you read thrillers you would predict it anyway. But I think that sometimes people go into books for that predictability, like they don't necessarily want it to do something different. But yeah, for me it didn't really work. And so what the 3 books I've read in this video, I haven't really loved any of them, and it just goes to show that just because I think I like historical fiction, it doesn't mean that the whole genre is for me, which is not something news to me. Reading the 10 Goodreads Choice Awards historical fictions and like 8 to 9 of them not being for me meant that I wore myself out on the type of historical fiction that I don't like. And back when I bought this, when it came out, I didn't know so well my taste in historical fiction, and maybe I would have even enjoyed it if I had read it, what, 7-8 years ago now, because maybe 2014, so nearly 10 years ago. I would have maybe enjoyed it more then, because my taste maybe hadn't changed when I was 20 compared to now when I'm 30. I didn't enjoy it. I definitely obviously will still keep reading historical fiction, but I am definitely still going to be picky about it. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below about historical fiction, about this vlog, about historical fiction that you think I would enjoy. I'd love to hear that from you in the comments, and I will see you again very soon. I put out new videos twice a week, so remember to subscribe, like this video, all that stuff, and I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching.